and gentlemen,
can I please have your attention? Can you dig it?
Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Very excited about today's guest. This is a real, he's got a book and he's this big fancy pants guy who wears belts at the Atlantic and all that. But he's one of these guys who I've known for, I hate to say it, I think it's coming up on 30 years now. In the early days, well, we'll get to how that's a fact in a second, but first let me introduce him because I suppose I got to do that. Franklin Foer is a former editor of the New Republic. He's a national correspondent for the Atlantic, and he's a fellow at the New America Foundation.
I'm actually not a fellow at the New America Foundation. That's some sort of vestigial piece of the internet that you've consumed.
I apologize. The bio I have is from your the Penguin Random House Speakers Bureau. For years, like 15 years after I did it, I was still commonly introduced as a occasional co-host of Crossfire, which was particularly funny since the show had been canceled for like 7 years.
Yeah.
But this is gold, so we're just keeping it all in. He is not at the New America Foundation, but he is at the Atlantic, and he's the author of many books, the latest of which is The Last Politician, Inside Joe Biden's White House and the Struggle for America's Future. Franklin Foer, welcome to the Remnant.
So good to be here.
So for listeners who don't know, I've mentioned this when Will Salatin's been on here before he went to the Bulwark, and he was sort of the house goy of this podcast.
Except that he's Jewish, but yes.
I know, but I just mean like for a while I was like the house goy at NPR. I was like the conservative they brought on, and it's like he was like the liberal guy I would get into arguments with. And you, Dave Plotz, Will Salatin, this guy, Seth Stevenson, and a rotating cast of like Michael Kinsley and those guys we didn't really have lunch with, but the younger people like you
yes.
and me, we shared offices on the 12th floor of the AI building. You had nothing to do with AI at the time. I kind of had nothing to do with it. I was a television producer, but complicated. But we would have lunch all the time together and get into these great sort of liberal conservative food fights at lunch. And you were working at Slate at the time, and which is still a thing notionally. And but maybe we can talk about that a little bit.
You're making me misty-eyed, man.
I know. It's lost its charming neoliberalism.
But it's also, can I interject one thing, which is
Absolutely.
that it was that world that we existed in felt like it disappeared awfully quickly. That, so it just the idea that this AEI building that Herb Stein, I think, was the great economist,
mm-hmm.
was the one who invited Slate into the building. And there was something kind of wonderful about having the electricity of having people who don't agree with one another coexist on the same floor. We were actually we were in the same suite of offices, I believe. And there were some parts of it that were fun. So Michael Kinsley, who was the editor of the Slate, really disliked your boss, Ben Wattenberg.
Yeah, that goes around. Yeah.
And so I would torture Michael when he would come to visit, and I'd steal headshots of Ben Wattenberg from your office. And I'd just put them everywhere that Michael Kinsley went over the course of his day. So he'd open up his laptop and there would be a picture of Ben Wattenberg smiling at him. He'd go to the bathroom. I'd make sure that there were Ben Wattenbergs everywhere. Those were the days.
I'm not sure I would have been able to handle that too much either. I had a weird relationship with Ben. But it was great to have you guys around. And obviously Kinsley I was a big fan of, but I had my dad loved to argue with the New York Times because he thought it was a worthy opponent kind of thing. Like Kinsley's brand of liberalism could drive me crazy. And this sort of formula of the way he would write about how if conservatives actually believe what they say they believe, they would be against aborting the skin cells on their thumbs because that could be turned into a human too. And it's like, maybe you're just, it's a lot of logic chopping kind of stuff. But he was a great guy to sort of engage with. It's not like I knew him all that well personally. So I was grateful to him. He gave me one of my first writing assignments for Slate. But it was just a great idiosyncratic bunch of people to hang around with and get into stupid arguments with.
Yeah, no, I remember that first piece that you wrote for Slate. I don't know if I'm hijacking the show by just being a nostalgic, because it was in the middle. It was at the onset of the Lewinsky scandal, and you did a breakfast table, I believe, and I can't remember who you did it with.
Margaret Carlson.
I remember you describing running into, maybe it was running into like Lanny Davis, running into somebody at getting bagels, and you described how they were getting a bagel with a hefty dose of smear.
Yeah. Wordplay.
Wordplay. It was good wordplay. It was quality. It was, I mean, it was just wordplay that it was just so apt.
Those were indeed different times. And it was funny how all of a sudden, when I had sort of inside info about the Lewinsky stuff and all of that, which is not a memory lane we need to go too far down, how all of a sudden, all of these sort of liberal journalists who normally just, really didn't spend too much time talking to me, just, hey, how you doing, Jonah? Calling me up on the phone and wanting to have a deep and personal conversations.
But can I just say an earnest note, which is that, as we're celebrating this kind of quaint bygone world where liberals and conservatives would share lunch in the AEI dining room and would trade insults in kibitz and in this kind of fraternal sort of way. But I did learn so much from the course of those sorts of interactions about conservatism, which wasn't just this foreign enemy. It was something that to be interrogated. It was something that when I had questions, I'd get pointed in the direction of the right book to read. I would get even some of the kind of asides that you'd get in the hall that were just provocations were things that made me actually reconsider things that I hadn't actually ever challenged in my own first principles or precepts. And so it was enormously beneficial to me as a human being, I think, to have that kind of ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I talk a lot about I sort of got a graduate education working at AEI as a young research assistant, but like a big part of like how to like engage in good faith with liberals I got from hanging out a lot with you guys, and also my I used to do dog and pony stuff with Peter Beinart all the time, and your replacement or predecessor at the New Republic. And I won't, people keep asking me, why don't you have him on to talk about Israel stuff on your podcast? And it's because I don't want to get into a nasty conversation with Peter because he's a friend. But it was, it's really good to talk to people you disagree with if you can assume a certain amount of good faith on their part. And there's so little of that today, which is so weird.
Yeah, even on Israel, where I don't agree with Peter, I make myself kind of read his stuff and watch him, because even if I'm never going to land in the same place that he lands, it helps remind me about certain parts of the moral dimension of the conflict that I would rather, that are easy to shunt to the side. And so I think it's that type of engagement, even with people we disagree with on, whatever way we disagree with them, even on issues that are the most sensitive to us.
Yeah, but I mean, there's another reason for it with the Peter thing, and I didn't mean to drag Peter into all this stuff, but is that I remember Kinsley telling this story about how someone wanted him to debate, like he thought Milton Friedman was completely wrong about monetary policy. And someone said, we'd like to host a debate between you and Milton Friedman on monetary policy. And Michael Kinsley was like, are you freaking kidding me? I'm not going to debate Milton Friedman about monetary policy. And it wasn't because like he thought Milton Friedman was right. It's just like there's a certain asymmetry of knowledge, right? If you spend all of your time doing deep dives on certain topics, it becomes very difficult for a generalist to come in.
Oh, yeah.
Because you just don't know what's wrong with some of their claims or some of their arguments. Not to say that bad faith or anything. It's just like, I'm not going to debate, even though let me put it this way. I would think very long and hard about debating some obscure foreign policy topic with Walter Mearsheimer, even though I think he's wrong about everything, simply because you need to know the moves 6 chess steps ahead about some arguments where your knowledge base just kind of goes off a cliff. I don't follow Israel with the granular detail that Peter does, but I can marvel at the fact that he can study with such detail and end up in a place I think is so wrong. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. We don't have to dwell on all of these things. You had a book. You wrote a book.
Yes.
About a guy. And normally I violated my first rule on this podcast, which is when I have authors on, the first question I always ask them is, what's your book about? So we're getting there now. So what's your book about?
I'm going to just narrate this as I experienced writing the book. So my publisher came to me in the summer of 2020 and said, write a book about the first 100 days of the Biden presidency. And I said, I was not exciting to me, in part because Joe Biden was not exciting to me. As his poll numbers suggest, he's not exciting to very many people. I thought it was interesting, the idea of writing about a group of people who were going to be kind of rushing into a government in the middle of the pandemic and dealing with all these broken institutions of government. And I'd never done a piece of access journalism before, which made me both very nervous about doing it, but also interested in trying out something new and different. And so I went ahead. And then, of course, as these things happen, the book ballooned on me. And it was expanded to be a book about the first year and then about the first 2 years of the Biden presidency. And I would say, in part, the book doesn't just chronicle the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Ukraine war, the legislative sagas. It also chronicles the way in which I came to have much more respect for Joe Biden, I think, over the course of watching him up close. That this guy who I'd always thought of as a bloviator had technique that I didn't actually know that he possessed. And really, it was about the way in which I ended up respecting this kind of cartoonish version of what a politician is much more over the course of observing him up close.
Okay, so I've only dipped in and out of the book. I've had like 25 authors on here in the last 6 months. And
right.
I got
you're forgiven.
Let me level set here. I hear you on having a newfound respect for just like normal politicians.
Yeah.
Because one of the reasons why our institutions are broken, it seems to me, is because they're not doing normal politics, right?
Yeah.
And Congress is supposed to be this place where you trade favors and log roll and compromise and do committee work. And it's not doing that because everybody wants to be essentially a pundit on TV, and they're all making the perfect the enemy of the good. And they all think bipartisanship is the worst thing in the world. And a lot of the things that would fix our politics is to get back to like the old Tip O'Neill thing, all politics is local. It's just not true anymore. All politics has been nationalized in a lot of ways. And so at the meta level, I'm very sympathetic to your, sort of, because it happened to me too, your newfound appreciation for like normal politicians and normal politics.
Yeah. And yet.
And yet, I am unpersuaded that Biden himself is as good as you suggest at normal politics. And I was, like some of the anecdotes from your book suggest that he kind of, as Lyndon Johnson, to paraphrase Lyndon Johnson, steps on his own Johnson on a lot in these kinds of things. And so I'm just wondering, like, what is the best argument? What are the best examples of some behind the scenes things that show he's a really good politician?
Yeah. So I think that the problem, the paradox of Joe Biden is that he's such a messy guy, and that the messiness is just is a default because he ends up he's a gaffe machine, as he's dubbed himself at one point, and he's somebody who does make mistakes as he goes, but that quality is also the thing that makes him a good negotiator, and that he's able to kind of see the messiness in other people at his best, and that means that he can then shelve his ego and respond to their ambitions, to their ego, and get to yes. And so, I think that constructing in the long, messy pursuit of his domestic agenda, where he was pursuing, I think, probably far too much given his 1-vote majority in the Senate. But it was also, he was bringing together this coalition of Democrats to get to something. He, in dealing with all of the bloated expectations and the bloated egos that he needed to deal with there, he gets to yes. And it's a really messy process. But I think you judge the guy on the victories that are accrued. And, there are a lot of things that have happened in his presidency that would have been the source of drama or worse sources of drama in past presidencies, whether it's the debt ceiling negotiation or the Silicon Valley bank bailout that he disposes of relatively simply. And I think when it comes to managing things like the Ukraine war or relations with China, or even I think the Gaza war, what he's shown is a willingness to take risks that I think would have scared other politicians. And he pushes in an aggressive sort of way. But, to his credit, I think he is acutely aware of the risks of going over the guardrails. And so he's able to, with Ukraine, I struggle to imagine, especially any Democratic president, but even most other potential contenders for the presidency, to have given the Ukrainians as much as we've given the Ukrainians, and also, managed the relationship with Russia in such a way where he's tested and poked and prodded and kind of tried to figure out what the limits are in the course of this. And with China, the same thing, where he's kept the Trump tariffs in place, which I'm sure is something you probably don't necessarily agree with, but he's pushed them hard in lots of ways that are both contiguous with Trump and a break from past democratic orthodoxy without going to war with them. And I think with Israel, I think it's a very good example of him applying his psychological theory of politics, that he, by hugging Israel as close as he has, which is both a matter of principled Zionism on his part. I mean, he's not just the last politician in the title of my book. He's probably the last Zionist in a certain sense, but he's done it in a way where he's also acutely aware of the psychology of the nation that he's dealing with, and Bibi's own psychology. And he understands how he's not just doing the right thing in the moment, but that he's also building leverage so that he can not just protect Israel's security in the short run, but also kind of manage America's interest in the region over the long run.
All right, so I'm going to circle back to some of that stuff in a second, but just because it's front of mind on that point, I go back and forth about whether or not what to believe in terms of how much the United States is actually pressuring or was actually pressuring, because now it sounds like Israel is going in on the ground in Gaza. But there was a lot of criticism from the right and elsewhere about how he says Israel has every right to respond. They should do whatever they have to do. And then within 24, 48, 72 hours, there's all of these stories about how the White House is pressuring, the Defense Department is pressuring Israel to delay a ground invasion. And I just honestly don't know. Like, was that actually happening? Or was that a cover story that gives everybody some room so that Biden gets to say, hey, look, I got them to delay this, when in fact Israel was never going to go in right away anyway, because they didn't want to take the bait that Hamas was setting.
I think what happened in that instance was that you had like a political elite in Israel that was reeling and was confused and needed actually somebody to step in and ask some hard questions of it about what it was actually trying to accomplish, other than justifiably exacting revenge. And so by going in and sitting in the war cabinet, he wasn't dictating policy, but he was asking what I have a chapter in my book about the Gaza 2021, where May 2021. So when he comes into office, 3 or 4 months in, Hamas starts lobbing rockets at Tel Aviv and the rest of Israel, and Israel has to respond. And Biden tells his aides, he's like, look, we're scrapping the playbook here. Like normally you would try to dispatch John Kerry to the Middle East to do shuttle diplomacy, and you'd call for a ceasefire straight away. And his response was, A, I believe Israel actually has a right to defend itself here, and that's the matter of principle. And then B, there was a matter of psychology. He's like, I've known Bibi Netanyahu since the 1980s. And I know that the best way to manage Bibi is to bank emotional trust with him and to show that I'm on his side. And then there's going to be a moment as his friend, I need to tell him, the gig is up here. And so that there was a moment where they'd exhausted their targets in Gaza, and Biden has a call with them, and he literally tells them the runway is up, your runway is up here, and it's time to wrap it up. And he gets to a ceasefire. And so a conflict that in the course of the Obama administration extended over 3 months was wrapped up in the course of 11 days because he operated from this position both of love, but also psychic acuity. So I think that when it comes to calling for the delay here, not calling for the delay, he didn't call for anything. It was done in the spirit of friendship. It was done, I think, covertly before it was publicized to the world. I think he was doing it kind of out of a principled desire for Israel to do what was best in Israel's interest.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, I you may be entirely right. My point is like there are places where I am perfectly happy to ding Biden as making a mistake or something like that. But like watching this unfold in real time over the last 3 weeks, the people who are taking all the leaks or statements from the White House or from the Netanyahu government at face value, it just strikes me as a mistake because we're going to find out, there's a Frank Foer right now writing the second book of the Biden administration. And we're going to find out that I'm not saying we will find it. We'll find out something along the lines of Biden saying, I have to take this public line this way, but in private, here's what, where the lines are, and they're different than what we're saying in public. And that happens in real unfolding crises in real time, and it's just, there's this cable news pundit obsession with, since these are the only facts we have, let's take them as the total universe of facts that exists, and they all must be correct, and then we can get to opine on things in ways that are going to be disproven later. And there's a lot of that going on right now.
No, without a doubt. There's a lot of that going on. His relationship with Bibi is super interesting. If I could dwell for a second, because he's always had this attitude towards him. There was a trip he took in, I think it was 2010 to Jerusalem, and Bibi kind of ambushed him by announcing, because Obama was pushing on settlements, and Bibi, in the middle of Biden's trip, announced settlement construction in East Jerusalem. And it was very embarrassing for Biden. And there were lots of people in Washington who were telling Biden he needed to come home and just tell Bibi to F off. And his response was to come up to him the next day and hug him and say, look, how do we make this better? And that's just his relationship with Bibi and the Israelis is, I think, tends to be much more forgiving, certainly than the Obama-Kerry position. I mean, when I started talking to people in the administration straight after October 7th, they made it very clear Biden and Blinken are not going to do the Obama-Kerry thing, and that was a distinction they were drawing in their heads, and I don't think they were just telling that to me to blow smoke. And I think it's real, that distinction.
There's so many places I can go with this, but let's since you brought it up, what is sort of the Biden teams and Biden himself, right? Because Biden's got this very close group of people who've been around him since his Senate days. And they were with the vice president. There's been a lot written about the tensions between the Obama people and the Biden people, and Biden having hard feelings and all that. What is Biden's relationship with Obama, and what is Team Biden's relationship with Team Obama?
Yeah, so it's cordial on the surface, but I think it's chilled out a little bit over the course of the presidency. But when he came in, there was this sense that he was going to do things differently than Obama. That Biden knows that Obama would roll his eyes at him. Class is at the core of Biden's self-identity, and it was at the core of his tensions with Obama, that Obama was this effete Ivy Leaguer. Obama was this effete Ivy Leaguer. Biden was somebody who was always acutely aware of the fact that he went to a state school. And the way that he talks, it's not just a product of where he comes from, but I think that he views his manner of discourse as being too working class, too folksy, too unpolished to ever win favor with the Obama inner circle. And so they would roll their eyes at him. He would know that they were rolling their eyes at him. And that would be the type of thing that would propel him to talk even longer in those types of conversations, because it just preyed on his insecurities in that sort of way. And I think that, operating off of that point of comparison is both a strength because it's born of experience, but it's also the type of thing that presumably gets carried too far in certain circumstances, because not every mistake was an eternal mistake. It might have been a mistake in certain circumstances, and it's the problem of fighting the last war. And I think that sometimes has been Biden's problem. So, I mean, case in point would be the American Rescue Plan, the stimulus package that he passed straight out of the box, and he was determined to go too big. That was his instinct, was because Obama hadn't put enough stimulus into the economy in 2009, he was going to overcorrect for that mistake. And that's born of certain analysis that he has about the long-term scarring effect of unemployment, and that it was better to push for a full employment economy. So he was intentionally running the economy too hot. And while I don't think the American Rescue Plan was the primary cause of inflation, it certainly contributed to inflation. And I think it had certain risks for the rest of his domestic agenda to invest so much in that first piece of legislation. And so in that instance, I think he was fighting the last war.
See, where I thought you were going to go with the last war thing was with Afghanistan, because my memory was that, Biden had these weird statements in the Obama administration about how the generals will lie to you. And I kind of got the feeling that Biden went into the Afghanistan thing trying to win an argument that he lost in the Obama administration, and was not looking at the facts on the ground in a particularly clear way. And we saw the consequences of it.
I think that's kind of the analysis in my book, which is, and as it happens, I think that was also Milley's analysis too, to a certain extent, that Obama had been boxed in by the Pentagon in the course of making his own decision, that they presented him with a series of options and they leaked quite a bit in the course of those proceedings. And Obama felt boxed in by the decision. And so Biden was determined to win a bureaucratic war that actually wasn't even being waged, because Milley was so committed to the idea of restoring civilian rule. And he was so worried that it would be accused of launching a coup, which was what the accusation was, that kind of hovered over him at various moments during the Trump presidency in fairly incoherent sorts of ways, that his inclination was to just kind of back off. He would give Biden his best advice, but he wasn't going to wage war behind his back by leaking and he was going to be a good soldier and salute with whatever decision that he made. But I think the problem with the way that Biden structured the process for withdrawing from Afghanistan wasn't necessarily the outcome that he desired. It was the way in which the people of Afghanistan never really entered into his calculus. And I think that was the cardinal sin that ended up resounding over the course of the next couple months, that they never really were committed to a humanitarian evacuation of Afghanistan. They never really thought about the humanitarian consequences of their decision. And I don't know what the right decision was, but obviously, as things played out, it was pretty clear that they had underprepared for the humanitarian consequences of what they were, of the policy that he preferred.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, I often say that other than appointing Kamala Harris, the withdrawal from Afghanistan was the biggest mistake of Biden's. I mean, technically Harris wasn't picked when he was president, but those were his two biggest political mistakes. But what would you say if you could give Biden truth serum about the Afghanistan decision and how it played out? What do you think he would actually say?
I think he would be, I think he is stubbornly defensive about that decision. He really believes he made the right call. He thinks that it was inherently messy getting out, which is what he believes, but it's not what he told the American public. This is the problem. Like if he had said to the American public when he withdrew from Afghanistan, I'm about to do something that's going to be really ugly and really messy, and I have very limited ability to deal with that because even though I'm president of the United States, this war is getting out of a war that would be one thing. I don't think that would be true. I think that the president has lots of recourses in the course of even executing a policy like that. But I think he believes that he pivoted in this moment of pressure when everything had collapsed and was able to get 125,000 people out of the country, and that's an achievement that everybody underrates. That's what he thinks in his own head.
My point at the time, my point to this day is that it seemed to be, other than the point we already discussed about him trying to settle an old argument, was there were a lot of people who looked at the polls said American people don't want to be in Afghanistan and they want to get out. I would have said, I don't want to be in Afghanistan. I'd like to get out. There are like 3 other stages of analysis required about how do you get out, when do you get out, on what terms, and so it's sort of, to me, it was always sort of reminiscent of, remember when ISIS cut off, and everyone wanted to get out of the Middle East in the Obama administration. They were right. American people were sick of all this stuff. And then ISIS cuts off the heads of a couple of Americans. And all of a sudden, Americans are like, oh man, you shouldn't have done that. We got to go in. And American people can change their minds about things. Everybody would want to have gotten out of Afghanistan if it wasn't humiliating and embarrassing and didn't look like Saigon, particularly when it was Biden who introduced, in many ways, will this be like Saigon conversation into American politics. And then it looked like the fall of Saigon. And so it's always seemed to me the political blunder, forget the geostrategic blunder about pivoting to Asia and then withdrawing a major listening post in Asia. The political blunder was thinking that there was deep support in the polls for bugging out under any circumstances and at all costs. Whereas instead it was a sort of a directional, a notional kind of like, yeah, I don't want to be there. It'd be good to get out of there. But that doesn't mean we want the Taliban to take over. It doesn't mean that Americans are going to get killed pulling out, or we're going to give all these weapons to the Taliban. And it felt very poll driven to the extent it wasn't settling.
It wasn't poll driven. I mean, I think it was something.
Or should I say poll justified?
I'm sure it is poll justified. I think that everybody who had objections to the policy were able to justify it as by the polling, to say, okay, this is what the American people want, and therefore I'm not going to object too strenuously to what the president of the United States wants to do. But in his view, he was somebody who has, we talked about his relationship with Obama, his relationship with the foreign policy elite is equally contorted. And that is driven by the same class anxieties, that he would love to get the approval of the Council on Foreign Relations, but he knows on some level that he can't get the approval of those types of people. And so he thinks he's then in his head constructed this idea that they're lazy, they're hidebound, that he's the contrarian, that he went to Afghanistan all of these times. He could see before anybody else that it was a failed exercise in nation building, all these promises that the generals always made, that Afghanistan was just about to turn the corner, the government was about to get less corrupt, Taliban were about to disappear in the next campaign. He could see the hollowness of all of those promises, and he felt like he was the only person who had the contrarian courage to go in there and to rip off the Band-Aid, to use the first cliche that comes to mind. But that's what he thought. That's what he genuinely thought.
All right, so switching gears, because we could argue about Afghanistan a lot. But so on the right, there are two, I mean, it's very similar to like to Bush era left-wing craziness. There's this right-wing thing where people simultaneously want to hold that he is a doddering, drooling, incompetent who can barely figure out, like a Mr. Magoo who has no idea what he's doing or where he's going, and he's a criminal mastermind. And you can't have both, right? People wanted to say that George W. Bush was a blithering idiot and the architect of one of the greatest, conspiracies in the human history, right? He's like, pick a lane, right? And so where do you come down? I mean, I understand that you've developed relationships with a lot of these people, and you have, a fondness for the guy that I don't. But like, how compass mentis is he? Like when you get asked at a Thanksgiving dinner by a relative, what's your answer to that question?
Yeah, is that he is compos mentis now. That he's actually, you could say that a lot of his qualities, which are the opposite of being a marionette, that he has a temper, that he is very stubborn, that he can dig in, that he rejects the advice of his advisors, like that those are all arguably signs of aging, but that's closer to who he is than being this vessel, and there's
he has said strange things at weird moments for 50 years.
But he's also clearly aging. It's like you don't have to be Bob Woodward to be able to uncover the fact that he's old he's really old, and that he's getting, that you look at video from the campaign and now you would see a change, as you see with every president of the United States, but not every president of the United States is 80 years old. And so that's, and the hard thing about aging is like, it's going to continue. That people age differently, and sometimes they fall right off of a cliff, and sometimes it's certain things go faster than other things. And, as an objective matter, it is kind of crazy, the idea of having an 86-year-old president. I don't think that's something that anybody would prefer.
No, I agree with that. I mean, I think we're going to get to Trump stuff in a second, but like, it is shameful and embarrassing for a serious country to have a situation where these two old men who are not in their prime, who are sufficiently unpopular that they have a chance of losing to the other one, are the choices that we've gotten ourselves into. And I'm perfectly open to arguments that Trump, the PJ O'Rourke line in 2016 was that Trump is unfit outside of normal parameters and Hillary was unfit with inside normal parameters. So perfectly legitimate arguments to make. But at the same time, this country can do better than where we've gotten ourselves.
Without a doubt. I would say one thing, though, which is that if this is the matchup we get, there are differences in. So this is all framed as questions of mental acuity. That Trump is clearly, there are mental acuity questions that could be posed of Trump, that he's a lunatic, right? And then there's mental acuity questions that could be posed of Biden, which is that he's too old. But those two things they don't really exist on a spectrum. They're differences in kind. Both of those questions are legitimate questions to be posed of a presidential candidate. But I think that sometimes there's this tendency to compress the two, even as I agree with you that this is not a healthy choice for American democracy.
Yeah, look, I mean, just to be clear, I think Trump is, independent of all other things, fundamentally unfit to be president of the United States, particularly after January 6th, right? I mean, it just is like, I agree with you entirely. It is a difference of category in terms of Biden. But part of the problem is that in the conversation that we get into as pundit types is you look through it in terms of the political realities of it. And these things as talking points, tend to cancel each other out. It doesn't matter how good they work as logic, but you can't, like, whatever you think about the Hunter Biden stuff, which we can talk about, like, it is bad politically because it gives the Trump people something to respond to.
Totally. And
right. And you call us corrupt. Well, what about this? Right. Then that's, and as a political matter, that's messed up.
And look, I wrote a book about Biden that is in a lot of ways a very admiring book. I mean, I think that you could look at the Biden who emerges from my pages and dislike him in certain ways that you probably didn't know that you disliked him before. But fundamentally, I think that he's done a good job. And the fact that he's been so unable to connect his accomplishments with the American people and to have them resonate in any sort of way. And conditions in this country, while not ideal, have been improving, especially over the course of the last year, whether it's the crime statistics or whether it's inflation or, we're still growing. We may, I hesitate to say we've nailed the soft landing, but right now we're in soft landing territory. And yet, like when matched against the lunatic, he's tied or maybe behind. And that is
Mm-hmm.
hard to ascribe to anything other than age.
All right, so that gets me to things. Your theory of the case is that his inability to sell his own accomplishments, to do better in the polls, to have a higher approval rating. You think that the mouse in the wheel at the center of this Rube Goldberg machine of Biden's problems is simply his age.
I think there are many problems. I think that inflation is a special type of economic pain that colors the way that people think about everything, and so I think that gets in his ability to talk about his accomplishments. I think there's a problem that he's had from the start, which is that is just some of the messiness of the problems that he's confronting. So crowing about conquering COVID is something that was hard for him to do because COVID never disappeared. Crowing about having an economy that is in soft landing territory is hard to do because the memory of inflation still lingers. And even as inflation continues to go down and interest rates are freaking high, which makes it hard to buy a new house or to start a new business or to do anything else in the economy. So those are nasty problems to have to contend with. And the world's on fire. And it's hard to say that you've been a steady hand, even if you have been, when and that hard to crow about what you've done for the Ukrainians when the Ukrainians are still engaged in an existential fight. It's hard to say that your wisdom has prevented us from getting into an existentially dangerous conflict with one of our powerful adversaries when there's a war in the Middle East and we have battleships all over the place and we have bases that are being attacked and we're intercepting rockets from the Houthis. That's hard case to make. But I do think that the thing about his age is that nobody is willing to credit Biden for things because they don't believe it. It's hard to say that he's run an energetic presidency where he's making these decisions when people look at him and they doubt that that's the case because of the way that he walks and the way that he talks.
So I had this theory, I wrote about it like inauguration week, that what Biden should have done is take a page from Eisenhower, right? Where admittedly different times in all sorts of ways, different economy, just won World War II and all that. But Eisenhower did not insert himself much into daily politics. He really kind of stayed above the fray, was kind of like America's grandpa. The fact that both parties at one point or another wanted him as their nominee tells you something about people's attitude towards him, right? But he ran on, but Biden ran on this unity thing. And one of the great things that Eisenhower did was he let political issues ripen. And then he went out and just sort of gave these kinds of like deliberately muddled sort of statements and then went back inside, right? But behind the scenes, he was a very energetic president. He actually knew how to run bureaucracies much more than Truman thought he was being able to. But he stayed above the fray. You can make the argument too much so with the McCarthy stuff. That's fine. But he didn't expend a lot of political capital on the day-to-day fights. And it seemed to me that those historians that met with Biden and said, you can go full FDR, you can go bigger than Obama, did not do Biden did not do Biden favors, because given the nature of polarization in America today, and given the nature of the Democratic Party, he basically, by swinging for the fences, burned to the ability to be seen as, and maybe it was never possible in the first place, given where the Republicans are, which is I'm entirely open to, but he could have picked some Sister Soldier moments. He could have picked some moments where he kind of gave ammo to moderate and centrist Republicans. That there was an ear in the White House, and I understand there were a couple bills that got Republican votes, but he really did not do nearly as much as the talking points claim about bringing back working across the aisle in a way that makes it culturally and politically safe to work across the aisle.
You think that's possible, that he could have done that? I mean, I think that I look at his numbers, and what I see is that when it comes to older white voters, to a lot of the Romney Biden voters, that he's still doing, they'll vote for him. That's not going to be his problem coming into this election. His bigger problem is going to be with Black voters, with Latino voters, with young voters, with people who don't vote. Nate Cohn wrote a piece yesterday about how it's all the people who don't vote in midterm elections are his issue. I think my sense is that he could win Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, but then lose Arizona, Nevada, Georgia. I mean, when I look at the map, the thing that I see is it's something that comes down to the one congressional district in Nebraska. But I think that with those voters in those places, it really is the lack of energy, the disconnection that they feel from his presidency. I think it's age. I really do.
Mm-hmm. And so the age, so I've been making the point for a long time, the age thing is itself kind of a euphemism, right? Because no one really talks about Bernie Sanders' age being a problem. It's the ways in which Biden shows his signs of age, which is, and like Don Rumsfeld had a steel trap memory, much better than mine in his late 70s or whatever. And Biden simply doesn't have that. Do you think that, like, if he had been dyeing his hair, if he still seemed compos mentis, anybody would care about the age thing? Or are you using age also just a little bit as a euphemism as well for seeming like he's lost a step?
I think it's seeming like he's lost a step. And I think it's people read age by looking at the way that he talks and looking at the way that he walks. And they all just scream old man. And that colors everything else. That it's not that, I agree with you that if he had leaned into being the national grandfather in that Eisenhower sort of way, that would have been maybe a palatable political persona for him to inhabit. But then the way that he walks and talks, sometimes it feels like he's not just the national grandfather, he's like the national great grandfather. There's something that's just extreme about it. People age differently. He hasn't aged in that Rumsfeld sort of way. He hasn't aged in the John Kerry sort of way.
I don't have a lot more time with you, and I got to ask about this. So, as you know, as well as you've been around doing this stuff as long as I have, there is a certain language of the green room and the commercial break that does not spill over when the camera goes back on. And when I and my friends and colleagues, whatever, talk to Democratic muckety mucks, I'm not saying that I've not heard anybody say in a while that Biden won't be the nominee or that he will drop out or anything like that. But it's rare when you talk to people in private and confidence, just trying to get, what is your side thinking, whatever kind of thing. It is treated as a much more of a live proposition, a live question, than the public-facing discourse would suggest, right? It gets, for completely understandable political reasons, it gets shut down right away. Biden's the nominee. He's not getting out, right? But then you have a conversation with some of those people in private, and they're like, look, it's a sticky situation. What do you want us to do? Blah, 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 blah. What is your sense of like the probabilities here, the reality of it?
I go back and forth on this, but I still think that there's some possibility that it won't happen. I try to correct for pundit wish casting, which is like a very real tendency in those green rooms. It's people want there to be something, among Democrats, there's kind of the bedwetting quotient, which is always there. But I think maybe backed up by polling this time in a very real thing. And then there's a sense that you want something that'll be interesting and exciting. And Joe Biden is a terrible TV character. Joe Biden is, he's so familiar. It feels to pundits like there's nothing new to say about him anymore. And I think Joe Biden also is so worried about saying the wrong thing that he has this tendency to not just self-edit, which I think is part of the problem with his persona, but to close himself off from the world. And so it allows for this impression that he is a marionette to fester. And, obviously people in media would prefer there to be a young, exciting candidate or a John McCain candidate who comes to the back of the bus and says whatever's on their mind. And he's become so far from that character.
All right. So another of the lightning round questions is, how's he getting along? What is the actual relationship between Harris and Biden and Team Harris and Team Biden?
Yeah. So this varies by the week. I think his relationship with Harris is distant but fine. That I think that there is something a little bit sadistic to the relationship where I think because he was a vice president, he's very acutely aware of treating her with a certain type of formal respect that he felt he wasn't accorded. But he also, I think, believes in some of the hazing that happens to a vice president. And so that's why she gets an assignment like Central America, which is so thankless. But it was the assignment that was given to Joe Biden himself. And the core problem is that he just doesn't need her in the way that Obama needed him, or that Obama felt like he needed him. Obama may have rolled his eyes at him. And part of the reason he may have done that is because he didn't like the idea that he was dependent on Joe Biden for certain foreign policy questions or to negotiate with Mitch McConnell and to do all these things that he either found distasteful or didn't want to do. He needed Joe Biden. Joe Biden does not believe, there's not a bone in Joe Biden's body that believes that he needs Kamala Harris in order to succeed. And so there's kind of this rote quality occasionally to the way in which he divides labor, which is bound to be the type of thing that makes a vice president who's already prone to insecurity, because that's the nature of the job, become even more insecure.
Team Harris, Team Biden?
Well, I mean, Team Harris has been so dysfunctional throughout the Harris vice presidency, and there's been so much churn there. I think it's said to be much more of a functional team than was there at the beginning. And I think the Biden people have gone through periods where they felt some exasperation with her, to periods where they feel like they need to defend her relentlessly. And they don't really have much of a choice there. They kind of, I think as a matter of self-preservation for themselves, they have to defend themselves relentlessly. So I think even in private, at this stage, they're loath to badmouth her.
Okay, so hypothetical. Biden picks Amy Klobuchar as his vice presidential candidate. And Klobuchar wows the media, charms them, seems super competent, all that kind of stuff, is generally more popular than Joe Biden. I don't think that's entirely implausible, right? It's not a wild kind of thing. Does Biden not run because he feels sure that Klobuchar could beat Trump?
I think the more pertinent hypothetical is whether Trump does. If Trump didn't run, would Biden not run? I think that Biden likes to believe in his own indispensability, that's a very comforting notion to him. And that he was the guy who slayed the dragon once, so you need to bring him back to slay the dragon again. That, I think, is easier for him psychologically than confronting his own mortality and giving up a job that he essentially loves. I think one of the underrated parts of his calculus is that, as hellish as a presidency in this stretch of American history might seem to the outside, it's something that Joe Biden thrills to. He really likes being president of the United States. He really, and the hardest part with aging politicians is that to give up your job requires confronting your own mortality. And I think that that's something that's, hard for every human being to do, but seems to be, probably especially hard for him.
I'm going to get an enormous amount of grief if I don't at least ask you about it. What is your bottom line position about the whole Biden crime family, Hunter, the investigation, all the rest?
Hunter is a total skis, and his father should have, at many stops along the line, told him to stop. That it was in addition to being the ethically right thing to do, it's a politically common sense type of thing to do. And, I'm willing to cut Biden some slack in the context of all of the familial trauma that it comes in, and like all of the guilt that I think is both layered onto, it layered onto the Hunter Joe relationship. That I think Hunter knows that he was not the beloved son, and Joe knows that Hunter knows that he was not the beloved son, which makes it very hard for him to say, "Hey, stop being an idiot." And to chastise him in that sort of way would probably feel like he was constantly telling him, "God, I wish you were more like Bo," which I think is the thing that Hunter finds probably hardest to hear in the world. So, that said, while I haven't seen anything that comes close to conclusively showing that Biden was self-enriching off of this relationship. I know that there's a lot of suggestive stuff that's out there, and it should be looked into, of course, but in order to take it, in order to treat it as more than smoke, there needs to be more than smoke there at a certain stage. And prosecutors have been poring over this for years. And having watched Merrick Garland, my sense of Merrick Garland is that he's not an idiot. He knows that if there is something there and he sits on it, it'll be the end of his legacy, and it would break this one thing that he cares most about in the world, which is his reputation for fervently following the rule of law. So I don't think that there is any sort of giant cover up there. I think that Hunter has been very poorly served by his legal counsel, which is another instance where if I was his father, I would tell him to get better lawyers, and I would tell him to take a plea bargain, even if it's one that doesn't insulate him from prosecution in a Trump presidency, because it's so politically important for him to have settled this and to at least legally move beyond it.
Yeah, so I am not deeply invested in this issue, but I feel obliged to just push back, and you can respond however you like. Insofar as I think it is pretty obvious that James Biden and Hunter Biden were in the influence peddling Joe Biden business.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
But as both of us know, influence peddling, qua influence peddling, is itself not a crime. It depends on how you do it, right? And it depends on whether or not you're in office or not. And so one of the places where I have a lot of skepticism about the Jamie Comer stuff and the Jim Jordan stuff is they will often not specify the timeframes where things are happening, right? So like my impression is that Joe Biden was not planning on ever running for president again or office again. He wanted to sort of get a payout, which a lot of politicians do now when they leave office, right? And so he starts working deals with his brother and Hunter to set up some speeches, to set up some consulting things where you get to meet him. But like, this is on his way out as vice president. And a lame duck vice president is one of the least powerful people in American life. And then a former lame duck vice president is even less powerful. And so a lot of the time you ask people about, oh, where did this money come from and all that kind of stuff. And they say, well, it came from the Chinese. Okay. But when? And he said, well, 2018, 2017. I was like, okay, well, so he wasn't vice president anymore. So that doesn't make any of it impeachable. It doesn't necessarily make it any of it criminal. It does make it sleazy, I think, in a certain sort of, it's not, the crime is what's legal, not what's illegal kind of thing. But so I think all of that is super, super ugly. And I also think that like Biden clearly has lied about not knowing anything or that Hunter didn't do anything wrong or any of that kind of stuff. I just don't see where I'm with you is they've yet to find a place of connecting the time, the money. I mean, we just saw last week, or was it a week before, that James Biden has now written a check to Joe for $200,000 they found. But again, it was from 2018. So, there needs to be more there.
I agree with that. I can't see anything wrong with what you just, I can't see anything where I would diverge too great from what that.
Yeah, I mean, like, I didn't think I was going to elicit outrage from you, but I just, but I thought it was important to be clear about it. All right, so last question, I guess, is, and I'll put it this way. I think Biden was really right and in some ways historically heroic for recognizing the Ukraine invasion, for the monstrosity that it was. Maybe he was correcting for what I thought was a bad Obama administration response in 2014. But my criticism of, that puts huge points on the board, right, for me. At the same time, I get exhausted with the, we'll give them whatever it takes, but no, you can't have this weapon system. No, you can't have this. No, you can't have this. No, you can't have this. And then, yes, okay, here it is, right? And so part of the question is how much of that is Biden working within the realm of the possible with NATO allies and the rest, and how much of it is him being more afraid of a Ukraine, that's probably unfair to put it, but like, I was going to say more afraid of a Ukraine victory than a Russia defeat. But there is this sort of no, yes thing rather than just going all in. And the reason I put it in that context is because I care about that, but also, are there, other than Jake Sullivan, right? And maybe, I don't know who else. Like, the Reagan administration had a lot of Reaganites. The Obama administration had a lot of Obamaites. The Bush administration had some Bushies, right? I mean, there were some people who were ideologically aligned and they immediately knew what the boss wanted. It does not feel to me like the Biden White House is full of people who are allegedly pragmatic, centrist Democrat types, or at least that's how, there's not a lot of mini Scranton Joes in the administration. And it feels like over time, he is often sort of pulled more to the left than he might otherwise like, because there's not equal counterpressure on the other side of him. And this gets in part to the sort of the standard rap that he was never a centrist. He was a centrist within the antipodes of the Democratic Party. So I lied when I said it was the last question because I crammed 4 questions in there. So just take that anywhere you want to go.
So I think it's important with the questions about weapon systems to ask what they would have done on the battlefield and how significantly would they have changed the course of the second Ukrainian counteroffensive, because we gave them what it took in order to manage the first counteroffensive in a very effective sort of way. And I honestly think that there's probably not that much that could have been done differently to shape the contours of this counteroffensive, that in order to get the air cover that they needed would take significant amounts of time to train. Yeah,
but if we'd said yes to F-16s a year and a half ago, they'd have the F-16s now, right?
I have to go back and look at the timeline that it would take to get all the pilots trained and up to speed. I mean, there's a couple problems with that. I mean, one is that the Ukrainian Air Force is thin to begin with, and then the second is that they don't speak English, and so there's it's not a quick process to get this up and running. And I think that the air defenses would be, it's important to have F-16s over the long run because they help preserve independent Ukraine and protect. But I'm not sure, when I've asked defense analysts to know this much, I have to have some humility about this, like that I just don't understand I don't understand how a certain weapon system will change anything on the battlefield. I don't actually think that the Ukrainians necessarily understand this themselves a lot of the time, because they want more, understandably, justifiably, as they should. But that doesn't mean that they are asking for the thing that will give them the decisive advantage in battle. So I just have to plead some humility on that.
Okay, but your argument is itself interesting insofar as you think it's purely based upon the merits of the thing and not a political thing. Okay,
I don't. I think that I think that it's not a political thing. I think it's a Joe Biden thing. I think that Joe Biden is there's like two parts to this. One is I don't think he likes being. There's part of him that chafes at being bullied based on Zelensky's pressure to give him something, and so his instinct is always to resist for reasons that are like a little bit vain and a little bit, but also that there is this prudence and caution baked into the way that he thinks about things, for better or for worse, and that he is a guy who grew up hiding under his desk in air raid drills, and so he does ask questions about escalation, and he needs to be persuaded that something won't result in escalation before he gives it. I would argue that he doesn't need to fear that. We've had enough evidence to the contrary that it's not going to contribute to escalation in Ukraine, and that he could afford to be less cautious than he has been. But then your question is he sui generis? Does he represent something? Is he this atavistic character who doesn't represent anything, any real current within the Democratic Party? And is he pushed to the left because he's barometrically planted to the center of the Democratic Party? I think that there is something to that line of analysis. I think that with foreign policy, it's not like he's generated this. Well, with Ukraine, I think that you did see kind of a surge of very mainstream Democrats rushing to the Ukrainian cause. And the psychodrama of that is complicated because it has to do with the Trump impeachment. It has to do with hatred for Putin that is baked. It comes from the 2016 campaign. But I think that there was significantly more support for a hawkish policy on Ukraine than you would have seen, certainly in the Obama administration, and that there was something maybe a little bit lasting there. But then you see on Israel, he hasn't been able to carry a lot of those people forward with him on his Israel policy. So I did not give you a coherent answer there.
No, that's fine. I mean, like, so I'll punish you for your incoherence. Just to ask you a straight up punishy question. What is the long-term possibility that that Democrats cannot sustain long-term support for Israel, and in many ways, the way Republicans seem incapable of sustaining long-term support for Ukraine now?
Yeah, I think that that's definitely a real possibility. I mean, I think that in some ways, Israel has been lucky with if there had been a Hillary Clinton presidency, if there had been a Joe Biden presidency, I think that forestalls an internal civil war in the Democratic Party over Israel. But it's hard to not see that coming at some point in the near future.
All right, Frank Foer, thank you for doing this. I should have you back because we can then, now that we've done the obligatory book promotion thing, we can get back to the old tradition of just yelling at each other about why we're wrong about things. But thanks for doing this.
I really enjoyed it.
Okay, so Frank Foer has left the studio, and it was great to catch up with him. I like Frank, as obviously I go back away with him. I anticipate, I'm very curious to see who I get the most grief from. Will it be from conservatives or Republicans who thought I went too easy on his descriptions of the Biden administration? Will it be from liberals and Democrats who think I was too harsh on the Biden administration? Or will it be from my reprobate friends who are also at lunch with the Slate guys back in the 90s who just give me grief for not giving Frank more crap about anything? But that time will tell. And as I mentioned in the last episode, the skiff is up and running. This is the members only, dispatch subscriber only podcast stream. We've got a lot of great stuff in there. We're going to have more and more great stuff in there, including, well, I don't know if it'll be great, but it may be of interest. I'm going to do AMAs in there, and the first one we'll probably do at the end of this week or the beginning of next week. So if you have questions on this or anything, what was Frank Foer like when he had hair? Anything along those lines, it's all fair game. Just send your questions to the Remnant at thedispatch.com. And if the is too onerous for you, you can also send it to Remnant at thedispatch.com. And obviously, there were places where I could have gotten into a snarky fight with Frank on a bunch of stuff, but I didn't want to just do it as just sort of a talking head pundit fight. And I thought hearing the good faith, and I think Frank operates in good faith, version that he knows better than I do because he spent a lot of time in the White House was interesting on the merits. And the book, again, I haven't read the whole thing. I've just been dipping in and out. Is really interesting and worth taking a look at for people who are interested. So with that, thanks again, and I'll see you next time.
No, you won't. This is a podcast.